By January of 1883, the Montana cold had turned Ironback Ridge into a blue-white wasteland. Months earlier, a widow with a 7-year-old son had taken a pickaxe to the back of her fireplace and begun digging straight into that hill. 40 feet underground. Timber braces, stone-lined walls, a passage carrying the fire's heat. Across the settlement, one respected builder had already begun burning his own furniture to keep his daughter warm. Then he stopped. Warm yellow light was glowing through her window, and beneath the snow-covered hillside, the stone was still holding heat.
The air was a liar. It spoke of endless summer, of warm pine needles baking on granite ledges, of creek water catching the August light in ribbons of silver that promised permanence. But promises made by Montana Territory air in the summer of 1883 were the cheapest currency on the frontier, worth less than the dust that settled on a dead man's boots. Vesper Hale knew this. She had buried the proof of it 6 months ago, in ground so frozen she had broken 2 fingernails down to the quick before the first shovelful of earth gave way. Now she stood at the back of her cabin, pickaxe, staring at a wall of granite that rose behind the structure in a gradual, indifferent slope. The hill had no name. The settlers of Ashvale called it nothing because it was nothing to them, an obstacle, a waste of acreage, a dead spot on any claim map. Vesper called it something else, though she had not yet spoken the word aloud. She called it a chance. Half a mile east, the men of Ashvale were doing what men on the frontier did every August with the fervor of the devout. They swung axes, they felled trees, they split logs into cordwood with a rhythmic, percussive violence that echoed through the valley of Ironback Ridge like the heartbeat of a settlement terrified of its own fragility. Great walls of stacked firewood rose beside every cabin, monuments to a single unquestioned idea. More wood meant more life. The man with the tallest pile slept easiest. The man with the shortest pile was already half a ghost. Vesper's pile was the shortest in Ashvale. It was barely a pile at all, a modest stack of split pine that wouldn't last 2 weeks in a serious cold snap, let alone the 5-month siege that a Montana winter could become. The women noticed, the men noticed more. They measured her inadequacy in cord lengths, the way they measured everything, by brute accumulation. A widow with a small woodpile was not a person. She was a liability. What none of them noticed, because none of them were looking, was the hole. It had started 3 days ago. A dark opening at the base of the granite slope, directly behind the cabin's back wall, where the massive stones of the fireplace met the raw earth. It was small enough to miss the width of a crouching woman, the height of a child standing on his toes, but each morning it grew deeper. Each evening, a fresh mound of excavated clay, decomposed granite chips, loose soil sat beside it like the leavings of some burrowing animal too large to be natural. Vesper Hale was digging into the hill, not down like a well, not out like a root cellar, straight back horizontal into the belly of the earth, beginning from the gutted rear of her own fireplace. The question that would soon consume Ashvale, whispered at the general store, debated at the smithy, pronounced with grim authority at the timber yard, was simple. Why? The answer was simpler still, though no one in town possessed the framework to hear it. She was not building a tunnel. She was building a debt collector. She was going to make the fire pay for its passage through stone, surrender every degree of heat it carried before she allowed it to escape into the uncaring sky. But that understanding would come later, after the dying had almost started, after the man who called her mad had crawled to her door on his knees. For now there was only a woman with a pickaxe, a hill that did not care, a 7-year-old boy sitting at the tunnel's mouth with his legs crossed, watching his mother disappear into the dark. Everett Hale was small for 7, with his father's brown eyes set in a face that had already learned the dangerous art of stillness. He did not fidget. He did not ask questions every 30 seconds the way other children his age did, the ones who ran through Ashvale's single dirt street chasing dogs or throwing pine cones at each other. Everett watched. He listened. He absorbed. When his mother emerged from the shallow tunnel dragging a bucket of rubble, he stood, took the bucket from her hands without being asked, carried it to the growing pile, emptied it, brought it back. His small grunts of effort were the only sounds he volunteered. Trust lived in his silence, trust so complete it operated like gravity, invisible, unbreakable, pulling everything toward a center that did not need to announce itself. He had been this way since the morning his father did not wake up. Before that morning, Everett had been a boy who laughed at the wrong moments, who named the mules after characters in stories his mother read aloud, who asked his father to explain, one more time, what it was like inside a mountain. After that morning, the laughter went somewhere deep below the surface, where it waited in the same patient way the cold waited outside a cabin wall for the fire to weaken. Elroy Hale had come to Montana from the coal country of eastern Pennsylvania, where the Appalachian ridges folded over themselves like the knuckles of a clenched fist, hiding seams of anthracite in their dark creases. He was a miner's son who became a miner, a man who spent more of his waking life underground than above it. The tunnels were not places of dread for Elroy. They were cathedrals of constancy. While the surface world swung between July's furnace heat, January's killing cold, the deep earth held steady, maintaining a temperature that barely shifted from season to season, a quiet, reliable warmth that had nothing to do with fire, everything to do with mass. He talked about this the way other men talked about God, with reverence, with a certainty born of personal experience rather than borrowed faith. Vesper remembered those conversations with a precision that hurt. Late evenings in this same cabin, Elroy's voice low, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, describing the Appalachian shafts. Down below Vesper, the seasons forget themselves. The rock holds a memory of warmth. Doesn't give it up easy, but it doesn't forget either. You could walk a mile into the mountain in December, touch the wall, feel July still living in the stone. She had listened the way a wife listens, with attention, with affection, without fully understanding why it mattered. Now, 6 months after his death, she understood. The understanding had arrived not as revelation but as arithmetic, a series of calculations performed at the same table by the light of a single oil lamp in the flattest, most desperate hours of a night in late July, while Everett slept behind a curtain that smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, grief. The arithmetic was merciless. The cabin's fireplace, a gaping stone maw that the previous owner had boasted about the way a man boasts about the size of his barn, was a masterpiece of inefficiency. It consumed wood at a rate that could strip a hillside bare in a single season. Its massive draft, the powerful upward rush of hot gas through the chimney, created a vacuum effect that actively pulled cold air into the cabin through every crack, every gap in the crumbling chinking, every warped board in the floor. For every cubic foot of hot smoke it sent skyward, it demanded a cubic foot of freezing outside air in return. The fireplace was not a source of heat. It was a machine for redistributing cold. You fed it wood, it fed you wind. Vesper had watched this transaction play out through one full winter, the winter that killed Elroy. She remembered the sensation of standing 4 feet from a roaring fire, her face burning, her back freezing, her husband coughing behind her in a bed pushed against the far wall where the temperature hovered just above the point where breath turns to fog. She remembered the woodpile shrinking with terrifying speed, Elroy too sick to swing an axe, herself too exhausted from nursing him to do more than drag in a few logs at a time. She remembered the cold not as an absence of warmth but as a presence, a living thing that pressed against the walls, seeped through the floor, waited. The arithmetic said, to survive the next winter using only this fireplace, she needed 3 times the firewood she could physically cut. She was one woman, 130 pounds, with blistered hands, a 7-year-old helper. The equation had no solution. 0 multiplied by effort was still 0. She could rebuild the cabin. No money, no skilled labor, no time. Winter was 3 months away. She could beg the community for help. They would give it. Ashvale was not heartless. But charity on the frontier was a transaction with its own brutal terms. Accept help once as you were grateful. Accept it twice, you were dependent. Accept it 3. You belonged to the people who helped you, your autonomy traded for survival, your future decisions subject to their approval. This winter, next winter, every winter after, Vesper had watched other widows walk that road. It led to a small, shrinking life, a slow erasure of everything that made you a person rather than a problem to be managed. The 4th option sat in a leather-bound notebook on the table in front of her. Elroy's notebook. He had carried it in his coat pocket every day of his working life, the pages soft with handling, the handwriting a barely legible scrawl of technical sketches, ventilation diagrams, notes on shoring angles, observations about rock density, airflow patterns, the behavior of heat in enclosed spaces. Most of it was specific to the Appalachian coal mines, shift schedules, seam measurements, equipment lists, but scattered through the practical notations like wildflowers growing in the cracks of a stone wall were Elroy's thoughts, his philosophy of Earth, his quiet, unshakable belief that the ground beneath your feet was not an obstacle to be conquered but a partner to be understood. Vesper opened the notebook to a page she had read 40 times. A diagram of a ventilation shaft, a long horizontal tunnel connecting a mine's working face to a vertical chimney at the surface. The purpose was airflow, fresh air drawn in through the horizontal passage, stale air rising up through the vertical shaft, creating a continuous circuit driven by the simple fact that warm air is lighter than cold air. Beside the diagram, in the margin, Elroy had scrawled a note in pencil. So faint she had to hold the page at an angle to the lamplight. Rock is slow, but rock does not forget. She turned the page. More diagrams. A cross-section of a mine showing how the temperatures stabilized the deeper you went, cool in summer, warm in winter, constant. Notes on how miners in the deepest shafts sometimes removed their coats, comfortable in the earth's own residual heat while blizzards raged above. A sketch of a long horizontal passage with arrows showing heat transfer, the rock walls absorbing warmth from the miners' lanterns, their bodies, the small fires they sometimes lit for ventilation, storing that warmth in its massive crystalline structure, releasing it back slowly, steadily over hours. Vesper stared at the sketch, then she looked up through the cabin's single back window at the slope of granite rising behind the house. Massive, dense, immovable. Every other settler in Ashvale saw that hill as dead weight, a chunk of the claim that couldn't be farmed, couldn't be grazed, couldn't be used for anything. Vesper saw a battery. The idea did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like dawn, a slow brightening at the edges of thought, a gradual illumination that revealed shapes already present but hidden by the darkness of convention. She did not need to heat the air inside the cabin. Air was a traitor. It warmed quickly, cooled faster, fled through every crack the moment you stopped feeding the fire. She needed to heat something that would hold, something massive, dense, slow. Something that once warm would radiate that warmth back into the living space for hours, days, without any additional fuel. She needed to heat the hill. The plan crystallized over 3 days of calculation, sketching, erasing, resketching. She filled 6 pages of Elroy's notebook with her own handwriting, neater than his, more deliberate, the penmanship of a woman who understood that a mistake on paper was free but a mistake in stone could kill. Step 1. Dismantle the back wall of the existing fireplace, opening a passage from the hearth directly into the hillside. Step 2. Excavate a horizontal tunnel, 40 feet, lined with flat creek stone, running straight into the granite slope. Step 3. At the far end of the tunnel, build a vertical shaft rising 20 feet to the surface, emerging through a stone chimney on the hillside above. Step 4. Rebuild the firebox at the cabin end, not the gaping, wasteful cavern of the existing hearth, but a small, tall, tightly sealed combustion chamber designed for maximum heat, minimum smoke. Step 5. Seal the old chimney above the new firebox, permanently. That last step was the one that would make people call her insane. Sealing the chimney meant severing the cabin's connection to the sky, the conventional escape route for smoke, the pathway that every fireplace in every home, in every settlement on the frontier depended upon. She would be placing her faith entirely in the earth, trusting that 40 feet of horizontal stone tunnel would provide enough draft, enough draw, to pull the smoke through without it backing up into the cabin, filling the room, suffocating her son in his sleep. The trust required was enormous. The physics were on her side, but physics in 1883 Montana territory was a word that belonged to universities back east, to men in spectacles who had never split a log or buried a husband in frozen ground. Here, trust was placed in things you could see, could swing, could stack in a pile beside your door. Trust in the invisible, in thermodynamics, in heat exchange, in the patient, molecular conversation between fire, stone, air was indistinguishable from madness. On the third night, Vesper picked up a pencil, turned to the page where Elroy had written "Rock is slow." But Rock does not forget, his letters leaning slightly to the right as they always did. Beneath his work, in her own upright script, she wrote a single line: "I will make the rock remember." She began the next morning. August heat pressed down on Ironback Ridge like a flat iron, the air thick with the smell of warm pine sap, dust, horse sweat from the timber road below. Vesper dismantled the rear wall of the fireplace stone by stone, each one heavy enough to make her arms tremble, each removal revealing more of the raw earth behind. Everett carried the smaller stones to a pile near the creek, his face set in that expression of grave concentration that made him look like a small, solemn old man. By the second day, the opening was clear, a dark rectangle in the back of the hearth, the color of wet clay, smelling of deep earth, of something ancient that had not seen light in geological time. Vesper took Elroy's pickaxe, the one with the hickory handle he had shaped himself, wrapped at the grip with leather strips now darkened by his sweat, still carrying the ghost of his palm shape. She hefted it once, feeling its weight settle into her shoulders. Then she struck the first blow. The earth resisted. It was a mix of dense glacial clay compacted over millennia, decomposed granite studded with fist-sized rocks that sent shockwaves up the handle into her wrists, her elbows, the joints of her shoulders. Each swing loosened perhaps a double handful of material. Each foot of depth was a campaign of attrition measured in hours, in blisters that opened, wept, hardened into calluses that opened again. She worked in the posture of a penitent, hunched, knees bent, arms extended into a space barely wide enough for the pickaxe's arc. Her only light was a single lantern hung from a nail driven into a temporary timber brace, its flame casting shadows that lunged across the raw walls like creatures startled by her intrusion. The work established its own rhythm. Morning, descend, swing, fill the bucket, drag it out, empty it, descend again, Midday, emerge, blinking into the absurd brightness of the surface world. Eat whatever Everett had prepared, usually biscuits, sometimes cold beans. Drink water from the creek. Sit for 10 minutes, feeling the sun on her face like a distant memory of a life that belonged to someone else. Afternoon, descend again. Swing until the light changed, until Everett's voice at the tunnel mouth called her back. Sun's going down, Mama. By the end of the first week, she had penetrated 8 feet. The tunnel was taking shape, 2 feet wide, 3 feet high, lined on the bottom with flat stones she pried from the creek bed during the brief rest periods when she couldn't bear the underground darkness any longer. The walls were raw earth, braced every 4 feet with timber frames she constructed from logs too small for the woodpile, notched at the corners the way Elroy's notebooks described, wedged tight against the ceiling to distribute the weight of the earth above. She was not merely digging, she was translating. Every stroke of the pickaxe was a word from Elroy's vocabulary, rendered in a language the earth could understand. She knew the principles of shoring because he had explained them during those late evening conversations she'd half listened to. She knew about airflow because he'd sketched it out, again the way a teacher repeats a lesson he knows will matter someday. She knew about the patient, relentless negotiation between structure, pressure, the way a tunnel is not a void carved in stone but a partnership, an agreement between the digger's intent, the earth's willingness to hold. Elroy had given her everything she needed. He just hadn't lived long enough to help her use it. The town noticed on the 9th day. Floyd Dench, who owned the general store with the observational instincts of a man whose livelihood depended on knowing everyone's business, was the first to piece together the evidence. Vesper had purchased rope. She had purchased lamp oil in quantities that suggested she was burning through it faster than cooking alone could explain. She had purchased a new bucket. These purchases individually meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern that Dent's commercial mind could not ignore. He asked her about it directly, in the store, with 3 other customers present, 2 wives from the settlement's north end, one elderly man named Putnam who repaired harnesses. Dench leaned across the counter, his voice pitched at that precise volume that pretends to be private while ensuring everyone in the room can hear. Mrs. Hale, word is you're digging something behind your place. Hole in the hill, they say. What's the project, raising rabbits or growing potatoes in the dark? The 2 wives exchanged a glance. Putnam studied a leather strap with sudden intensity. Vesper placed her coins on the counter, took her oil, her rope. She met Dench's eyes for a single measured beat. Then she walked out. The laughter followed her into the street. Thin, uncertain, the laughter of people who sense they might be missing something, but prefer the comfort of mockery to the discomfort of curiosity. By the 12th day, 12 feet into the hillside, she hit the boulder. It sat in the tunnel's path like judgment, a slab of granite the size of a steamer trunk, angled diagonally across the line she had so carefully plotted from Elroy's diagrams. She could not break it. The pickaxe bounced off its surface with a metallic ring that vibrated through her teeth. She could not go around it, not without veering so sharply off course that the tunnel's alignment with the cabin's firebox would be destroyed. 3 days she sat before it. 3 days of entering the tunnel, placing her lantern on the ground, staring at the rock's impassive face, running her hands over its surface as if feeling for a secret seam, a hidden weakness. 3 days of emerging at sunset with nothing accomplished, her face blank, her hands still. Everett, during those 3 days, did something he often did when his mother was stuck on a problem. He made a picture. Using a stick, scratching in the dirt outside the tunnel mouth, he drew a map: the cabin, the fireplace, the tunnel extending backward into the hill. He drew it from above, the way a bird might see it, the way his father used to sketch mine layouts in the notebook. His tunnel line went straight until it hit a circle, the boulder. Then, without thinking about it, without understanding the engineering implications, he drew the line curving gently around the circle, bending perhaps 15 degrees before straightening again toward the far end. Vesper emerged on the 3rd evening, saw the drawing, stopped. She knelt beside it, tracing the curved line with her finger. Then she went inside, opened Elroy's notebook, flipped through pages until she found what she was looking for: a passage about ventilation tunnels in the Pennsylvania mines. A note, almost an afterthought, about how slight curves in horizontal passages did not significantly disrupt airflow or draft efficiency, provided the angle remained below 20 degrees. The air, Elroy had written, was forgiving of gentle bends. It was sharp corners that killed the flow. Vesper looked at her son's drawing. She looked at her husband's note. 2 voices separated by death, answering the same question in the same way. The next morning she began to curve the tunnel. It added 2 days of work, 5 additional feet of length, but it cleared the boulder with room to spare. The line straightened beyond it, resuming its true course toward the far end of the 40-foot plan. For the first time in 3 days, the sound of the pickaxe echoed from the hillside again, a steady, purposeful percussion that the neighbors had grown so accustomed to they only noticed when it stopped. The second crisis came in the third week, 22 feet in. A section of the tunnel ceiling, a stretch where the clay was thinner than she had estimated, crumbled without warning. Not a catastrophic collapse the timber bracing held, catching the worst of the fall, but enough to fill the passage with a choking cloud of dust, enough to send a cascade of loose earth across her back, her shoulders, her hair. She lay still in the darkness. For a long time the lantern knocked on its side, its flame guttering, shadows crawling. The weight of the earth above her pressed against her awareness like a hand on her chest. She was not afraid. Fear had burned through her months ago, consumed by the greater fire of necessity. What she felt, lying in the dust with the earth settling around her, was memory. Elroy had described this: the small collapses, the warnings the earth gave before a major failure. He had lost friends this way. He had learned to read the signs, the hairline cracks in the ceiling, the subtle shift in the sound of a pickaxe strike that indicated a change in density above. He had learned to shore, to brace, to distribute weight across timber frames that turned the earth's downward pressure into lateral stability. She had those lessons. They lived in the notebook, in her memory of his voice, in the muscle knowledge her hands had accumulated over 3 weeks of underground work. She righted the lantern, she cleared the debris. She examined the timber bracing intact, holding. She identified the weak section of ceiling, a span of 2 feet where the clay layer thinned over a pocket of loose gravel. She cut 2 additional braces from her timber supply, wedged them into place at angles that redirected the load, packed the cavity above with a mix of clay, small stones. When she finished, the repair was stronger than the original structure. Then she picked up the pickaxe. Then she continued. Blythe Cara came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the aspens in the creek bottom had just begun their turn from green to gold, the first brushstrokes of a transformation that would, within weeks, set the entire valley ablaze with color so intense it seemed designed to mock the drabness of what was coming. Blythe was the doctor's wife, a practical woman of 43, with the kind of face that kept its own counsel, neither beautiful nor plain, simply present. She was not Vesper's friend. Friendship on the frontier required a social infrastructure that Vesper had never built: shared meals, shared labor, shared gossip, the currency of belonging. But Blythe possessed a quality rarer than friendship on the frontier: the ability to observe without judging. She stood at the tunnel entrance while Vesper worked inside, listening to the rhythmic strike of steel on rock, the scrape of rubble being loaded into the bucket. When Vesper emerged, dusty, sweat-streaked, Blythe was sitting on a log with 2 jars of preserved peaches in her lap. The conversation was brief. Blythe did not ask about the tunnel. She did not offer opinions on its wisdom or folly. She placed the peaches on the log, looked at Vesper with eyes that held neither pity nor admiration. Only a steady, clear-eyed acknowledgement that what was happening here was real, whatever it was. "If it gets bad," Blythe offered, her voice low enough that only Vesper could hear, "you bring the boy to my house, day or night. You don't need to explain anything. Just come." Vesper did not promise, but she nodded, a single tight motion that contained everything a promise would have, without the surrender. Blythe left. The peaches remained. That evening Vesper opened 1 jar, split the contents with Everett. They ate in silence, sitting on the cabin floor, the sweetness of preserved summer fruit filling their mouths, while outside temperature dropped another degree toward the season that was coming, whether they were ready or not. Gideon Stroud arrived on a Friday. He did not come alone. 2 men walked behind him: Putnam, the harness mender, a man of 60, whose silence was a professional habit, whose presence served as community witness in disputes. The second was a younger man named Briley, who worked the timber claim north of town. Broad-shouldered, slow to speak, uncomfortable with the role but unwilling to refuse when Stroud asked. Stroud was 52 years old, with the build of a man who had spent 3 decades lifting stone, squaring timber, forcing raw materials into shapes that served human habitation. He had built 14 of Ashvale's 23 structures. His joints were the settlement's joints. His roof angles were the settlement's roof angles. His chimneys drew, his doors hung true, his floors did not buckle. When Gideon Stroud spoke about construction, spoke with the authority of a man whose proof was the town itself. He was not a cruel man. Cruelty requires imagination, the ability to envision another person's suffering as a source of satisfaction. Stroud lacked that imagination. What he possessed instead was certainty, a bedrock conviction that his methods were correct, because they had produced results, because the houses he built were still standing, because the families who lived in them were still alive. Certainty of this magnitude is its own kind of blindness. It does not need to attack alternative ideas. It simply cannot see them. His shadow fell across the tunnel entrance at 2 in the afternoon, blocking the daylight that filtered into the first few feet of the passage. Vesper was inside, 26 feet deep, barely visible in the lantern's glow. She heard the voices, the heavy footsteps, the specific quality of silence that meant someone important was waiting. She backed out on her hands, her knees dragging the bucket behind her, emerging into the light covered in a layer of clay dust that turned her hair gray, her face the color of the earth she had been carving. Stroud watched her rise. He took in the tunnel mouth, the growing pile of excavated soil, the organized rows of creek stones waiting to be laid as lining, the timber braces stacked near the entrance. His eyes, accustomed to reading construction sites the way a tracker reads ground, registered the details with professional thoroughness. The assessment took perhaps 10 seconds. His opening was not a question. It was a diagnosis delivered with the flat certainty of a man pronouncing a structure unsound. "Mrs. Hale, this is not improvement, this is destruction." Vesper straightened her back. She did not wipe the dirt from her face. The dirt was evidence, testimony that she was not a woman talking about work but a woman in the middle of it. "I am improving my heating, Mr. Stroud." He gestured at the opening, a sweep of his arm that dismissed the tunnel, the concept behind it, the weeks of labor it represented. "Improving? You've torn out the back of your fireplace. You've undermined the foundation of your chimney. You are tunneling into solid granite with a hand tool." He paused, letting the absurdity accumulate. For what purpose? The smoke will travel through the tunnel before it reaches the sky. On its way, the stone will take its heat. The stone will hold that heat. The stone will warm the cabin. Silence. Putnam shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Briley stared at the tunnel mouth as if expecting something to emerge from it. Stroud's face underwent a subtle transformation, the shift from professional assessment to something more personal. The expression of a man whose deepest assumptions have been challenged by someone he considers unqualified to do so. "The smoke," he repeated, his voice dropping half a register, "will travel 40 feet on its belly through a hole in the ground before it stands up. Is that what you're telling me?" "Yes." "It won't. Smoke rises. It's lighter than air. It seeks the fastest vertical path. You're asking it to run a 40-foot horizontal race before you give it a chimney. It will refuse. It will turn around, pour back through that hole into your cabin, fill this room while you sleep." He looked at Everett, who was standing near the log pile, watching with those brown eyes that absorbed everything. "It will fill this room while your boy sleeps." The words landed where they were aimed, in the part of Vesper that knew, despite all her calculations, that she was gambling with her son's life. She felt them hit. She did not let them show. "Smoke has weight, Mr. Stroud. It prefers to climb, but if the path forward is clear enough, long enough, with a tall chimney waiting at the far end, the draw will pull it through. The vertical shaft at the end of the tunnel will create suction. The hot gas will have no choice but to follow." Stroud's jaw tightened. She was using words that made mechanical sense individually but described a system so far outside his experience that it might as well have been sorcery. He had built chimneys, dozens of them. He understood draft, understood the relationship between chimney height, flue diameter, combustion temperature. But his understanding was vertical. Up. Always up. The idea of routing hot gas horizontally through 40 feet of stone before allowing it to rise was not merely unfamiliar. It was an affront to the principles that had governed his entire professional life. He tried once more. "Even if the draft worked, which it will not, you've sealed yourself inside a stone pipe with fire at one end. One miscalculation, one crack in the lining, one shift in the wind direction, the reverse. Carbon monoxide. Odorless. You won't smell it. You won't see it. You'll simply stop breathing." He delivered this with the heavy gentleness of a man describing an inevitable outcome to someone too stubborn to accept it. "I have seen it happen, Mrs. Hale. Charcoal burners, lime kiln workers, men who understood fire better than either of us, dead in their sleep because the draft turned." Vesper felt the force of this argument. It was the strongest thing Stroud had said because it was true. Carbon monoxide was real. Draft reversal was real. The risk was not theoretical. It was the reason she had spent 3 days designing the vertical shaft at the tunnel's far end, calculating its height, its diameter, its relationship to the prevailing wind patterns on the hillside. It was the reason the shaft would be 20 feet tall, far taller than necessary for simple exhaust, creating a draw so powerful it would pull the gases through the horizontal passage with the authority of a bellows. But she did not explain this. She had learned in 26 days of solitary labor that explanation was a form of plea. It positioned her as the student seeking approval from the master. She was not his student. She was a miner's wife who understood ventilation because her life, her child's life, depended on understanding it. Instead, she spoke 4 words that Stroud would remember for the rest of his life, though he would not understand them for months. "The smoke will pay." He stared at her. The words made no sense in any framework he possessed. Smoke did not pay. Smoke escaped, dissipated, left soot on your chimney stones, creosote in your flue. It was waste product. You got rid of it as fast as possible. The idea that smoke could be made to pay to surrender something of value on its journey out was so alien to him that his mind simply refused to process it. Pay, he repeated, the word foreign in his mouth. Every foot of that tunnel the stone takes something from the smoke, heat. The smoke enters hot, it exits cool. The difference every degree it loses goes into the rock holds it. The rock gives it back to the cabin. Slowly. For hours after the fire is dead. Stroud looked at Putnam. Putnam's face was carefully blank, the face of a man who had agreed to witness, not to judge. Briley was studying his boots, the silence stretched. Then Stroud spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a verdict delivered not in malice, but in the absolute, immovable conviction that he was protecting this woman from herself. Mrs. Hale, if you continue with this, I cannot guarantee that this community will assist you when winter comes. We depend on each other. Every household that fails puts a burden on the rest. I will not carry the burden of a choice I warned against. The words were precise, calculated, final, not a threat, worse a withdrawal. On the Montana frontier in 1883, to be cut off from community support during winter was not a social inconvenience. It was a death sentence delivered by committee. Vesper looked at him. She looked at Putnam, at Briley. Three men standing in the August sun representing the collective judgment of every soul in Ashvale. She felt the weight of their certainty pressing against her own, a weight measured not in pounds but in consensus, in the terrible gravitational pull of unanimous agreement that she was wrong. Her voice when it came was steady, not defiant, not pleading, simply present the way Blythe Cara's eyes had been present, acknowledging reality without surrendering to it. Thank you, Mr. Stroud, I understand. She turned back to the tunnel. She picked up the pickaxe. She descended into the dark. Behind her she heard the 3 sets of footsteps receding. She heard Stroud's voice, lower now, meant for Putnam's ears. She could not make out the words, she did not need to. The words were the same ones that had been circulating through Ashvale for 2 weeks, thickening in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to draw properly. The widow's grief has turned her mind. The Hale woman is digging her own grave. When winter comes, we'll find her frozen with the boy. She swung the pickaxe. The earth gave another inch, another. The isolation that followed was total. No more visits, not even hostile ones. No more jars of peaches from Blythe Cara, who still nodded when they passed but could not risk more than that her husband practiced medicine in Ashvale. His livelihood depended on Stroud's goodwill, on the community's trust. The general store fell silent when Vesper entered. Floyd Dench served her with the exaggerated politeness reserved for the doomed, counting her coins with the careful attention of a man who suspects he is being paid by a ghost. Everett felt it too, though he said nothing about it. The other children who had never fully included him, the quiet boy, the miner's son, the one who didn't play right now, avoided him with the deliberate cruelty that children learn from their parents' silences. He walked through Ashvale's single street like a small, upright phantom, his father's gravity in his bearing, his mother's stubbornness in his spine. October arrived. The aspens completed their transformation, the valley drowning in gold so bright it seemed combustible. The nights grew sharp. Frost appeared on the cabin's window pane each morning, a delicate crystal script that spelled out warnings in a language everyone could read. The tunnel was 35 feet deep. Vesper could feel the change in the earth, the clay giving way to denser material, the temperature stabilizing, the air inside the passage taking on a quality of stillness that was not stagnation but equilibrium. The walls no longer wept moisture. The rock was drier, harder, more dense. She was entering the hill's true body, the granite core that had been there since the mountains were young. She worked with a fury that was indistinguishable from calm. Each stone laid in the tunnel lining, each timber brace wedged into place, each bucket of rubble hauled to the surface was a word in an argument she was making to no one but the earth itself. She was not building to prove Stroud wrong. She was building to keep her son alive. The distinction mattered. Proving someone wrong is a performance. Keeping a child alive is a covenant. The night the tunnel reached 40 feet, Vesper did not celebrate. She climbed out into an October evening so clear the stars looked like holes punched in black tin, leaking kung white afar. Everett was asleep in the cabin, curled on his cot, one hand tucked under his cheek. She sat on the log outside the tunnel entrance, Elroy's notebook in her lap, too exhausted to open it, too wired to sleep. The next phase took another week. The vertical shaft at the far end, 20 feet, straight up through the hillside, emerging through a chimney she built from carefully selected stones, mortared with clay, its opening angled away from the prevailing wind. From below, standing at the base of the shaft, she could look up through 20 feet of stone tube at a perfect circle of sky. Then the firebox. She dismantled the last remnants of the old, wasteful hearth, its gaping mouth, its shallow depth, its absurd proportions designed for spectacle rather than function. In its place, she built something that looked, to anyone accustomed to conventional fireplaces, like a mistake. Small, tall, deep, a vertical combustion chamber barely 18 inches wide, lined with the densest stones she could find, sealed at every joint with her clay mixture. It was designed for a single purpose: to burn hot, fast, to consume its own smoke in a blaze so intense that what entered the tunnel behind it was not thick, lazy, creosote-laden exhaust, but a stream of superheated gas moving fast, carrying maximum thermal energy. The final act, the one that sealed her reputation as a madwoman in the eyes of every soul in Ashvale, was the sealing of the old chimney flue. She packed it with stone, mortared it shut, smoothed the surface until no trace of the original opening remained. The cabin's connection to the sky was severed. Every molecule of combustion gas produced by the new firebox had only one path: 40 feet of horizontal stone tunnel, then 20 feet of vertical shaft, then sky. She had placed her faith entirely in the earth. She had bet her life, her son's life, on the proposition that rock remembers warmth. On the last night of October, with the temperature dropping toward freezing, Vesper lit the first fire in the new system. The kindling caught. The small logs she placed above it ignited. The flames rose in the tall, narrow firebox with a focused intensity that was nothing like the sprawling, wasteful blaze of the old hearth. This fire was concentrated, purposeful, almost angry in its efficiency. She watched the smoke. It rose to the top of the firebox, hit the sealed ceiling where the old chimney had been, curled for one terrible, breath-stopping moment back toward the room. Then the draw caught. The distant chimney on the hillside, 20 feet of vertical stone shaft heated by the first wisps of warm gas reaching its base, began to pull. The smoke hesitated, then moved backward into the tunnel mouth, slowly at first, then with increasing conviction, drawn by the suction of the rising column of warm air at the tunnel's far end. Within minutes, the flow was established, a steady, visible current of hot gas streaming from the firebox into the horizontal passage, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel like a river finding its underground course. No smoke entered the cabin. The air remained clear. Vesper fed the fire for 20 minutes, watching, listening. The draw was steady, the flow consistent. She could hear it, a low, continuous murmur from the tunnel, the sound of moving air, of heat being transported through stone. Then she heard something else, a sound from deep in the tunnel, not a crack, not a collapse, a thin, high-pitched hiss, barely audible, persistent. The sound of air escaping through a gap it should not be escaping through. She extinguished the fire. She waited for the smoke to clear. She lit the lantern. Everett watched her from his cot, his eyes catching the lamplight, dark, alert. She met his gaze, held it for a moment that contained everything she could not say, not yet, not until she knew. Then she lowered herself into the tunnel mouth, lantern first, elbows dragging against the stone lining, knees scraping on the flat creek rock she had laid so carefully over so many weeks. The darkness closed around her. The hiss grew louder with each foot she advanced. A thin, insistent whisper in the stone, the sound of a flaw she had not anticipated, a crack in the system she had staked everything on. She found it at the 23rd foot. A joint between two lining stones where the mortar had cracked during the first fire's expansion, not a dramatic failure. Not the catastrophic fissure she had feared in those crawling moments when the tunnel walls pressed close enough to touch her shoulders on both sides. It was a hairline split, barely visible in the lantern's amber glow, running diagonally across the clay seal like a thread pulled from a garment. But hairline was enough. At the temperatures the system would generate during sustained operation, that single crack would bleed heat into the surrounding dirt, instead of carrying it the full length of the passage, robbing the system of perhaps a third of its thermal efficiency. A third was the difference between a cabin that stayed warm through the night, a cabin that grew cold by midnight. Vesper pressed her thumb against the crack. She could feel the faintest whisper of moving air against her skin, the ghost of the fire she had already extinguished, residual warmth still migrating through the stone, finding this small escape, taking it. She lay on her stomach in the tunnel for a long time, her cheek against the cool creek rock floor, the lantern balanced on a ledge she had carved for exactly this kind of inspection. Above her, 3 feet of compacted earth. Below, more earth extending down to bedrock. She was suspended in the body of the hill like a splinter in flesh, a foreign presence the earth had not yet decided to accept or reject. The fix would require a sealant that could withstand repeated heating cycles without cracking again. The original clay mortar she had used, a simple mixture of creek bed clay pressed into the joints, was adequate for a structure that never changed temperature. but the tunnel would cycle from ambient ground temperature to several hundred degrees every time she lit a fire, then cool again over hours. The thermal expansion would work the joints like a slow, patient lever, opening cracks that no ordinary mortar could resist. She needed something that flexed, something that absorbed the expansion rather than fighting it. Over the next 3 days, she tested. The first formula clay blended with wood ash from the old fireplace cracked within an hour of being heated by a small test fire at the tunnel entrance, too rigid. The second clay mixed with chopped grass fibers held longer but crumbled when it cooled, the organic material shrinking as it dried, leaving voids in the seal. The third formula came to her at 4 in the morning, the hour when exhaustion strips away assumption, leaves only the raw, undecorated mechanics of a problem. She mixed clay with wood ash, added fine sand from the creek bottom, not the coarse gravel she had been using but the silty, almost powder-fine sediment that collected in the slow eddies behind the larger rocks. The sand particles, smaller than the clay particles, filled the microscopic gaps between them, creating a matrix that was denser than either material alone. Then she added a component that would have seemed absurd to anyone watching, rendered bear fat, traded from a trapper 2 months earlier for a pair of Elroy's work gloves she no longer needed. The fat, mixed into the wet clay, would burn away during the first firing, leaving behind a network of tiny air pockets, voids that gave the hardened mortar just enough flex to accommodate thermal expansion without fracturing. She packed the new mixture into the cracked joint at the 23rd foot. She packed every other joint in the tunnel, all 40 feet of them, crawling backward from the far end, working by lantern light, her fingers raw from pressing the mortar into crevices too small for tools. Took 2 full days. When she finished, she lit a second test fire. The hiss was gone, the draw pulled clean. The air in the tunnel moved with the steady laminar flow of a system that had found its equilibrium, no turbulence, no leaks, no wasted heat escaping into soil that didn't need it. She was not a genius who got it right the first time. She was something more durable than that. She was a woman who got it wrong, recognized the failure, refused to let it become permanent. The social architecture of Ashvale, meanwhile, had completed its own construction project, a structure of consensus built with the same certainty Gideon Stroud brought to his timber frames, mortared with the same unexamined confidence. The widow Hale was mad. The tunnel was a tomb. Winter would deliver the verdict. These propositions had hardened from gossip into doctrine in the weeks since Stroud's visit, acquiring the weight of established fact through sheer repetition. Floyd Dench was the primary contractor of this consensus. His store was the town's informational hearth, the place where rumors were kindled, fed, allowed to blaze. Dench did not invent the stories about Vesper. He merely arranged them for maximum circulation, the way a skilled merchant arranges goods on shelves, the most provocative items at eye level, the nuance tucked away on the bottom rack where no one looked. By late September, the narrative had 3 tiers. The first tier was pity the poor woman, alone, grieving, her mind broken by the loss of a husband she clearly depended on for rational thought. This tier was maintained primarily by the older women of Ashvale, who spoke of Vesper in the past tense even while she was still alive, as if her death were a scheduling matter rather than an open question. The second tier was judgment. She had been warned, offered help, given every chance to rejoin the community of the sane. She had refused. Her suffering, when it came, would be self-inflicted, which absolved the community of responsibility. This tier belonged to the men who repeated Stroud's verdict with the satisfaction of people who have been given official permission to stop worrying about someone else's problem. The third tier, darker than the others, barely spoken aloud, was anticipation, a collective, shameful curiosity about how the story would end, the same instinct that draws a crowd to a collapsing building. Only Blythe Cara stood outside this architecture, occupying a position that was not opposition but refusal to participate in the construction, to add her voice to the chorus, to treat another woman's survival as a spectator event. Blythe continued to nod when she passed Vesper on the street. She did not bring more peaches. She did not visit the cabin. Her husband, Dr. Cara, had made it clear that visible association with the Hale woman would complicate his practice. But the nod persisted, a small, stubborn gesture of human recognition that cost Blythe nothing she couldn't afford to spend. Mid-October brought the first hard frost. Ice formed on the creek. The morning air carried the metallic tang of approaching winter, a taste that every frontier settler recognized the way a sailor recognizes the taste of an approaching storm. Woodpiles were measured, remeasured, calculated against the calendar. The mathematics of survival reduced every household to a single equation, fuel divided by time. Those whose quotient fell below the threshold began to worry. Those whose quotient was comfortable began to pity those who weren't. Vesper's woodpile remained the smallest in Ashvale, but for the first time its size was intentional rather than inadequate. She had done her own calculations, different calculations, based on a different equation, one that no one else in the settlement possessed. Her system, if it worked as designed, would consume roughly 1/3 the fuel of a conventional fireplace. The modest stack of split pine beside her cabin, laughable by Ashvale standards, was sufficient for the math she was doing. The problem was that no one knew her math. They saw the small pile through the lens of the only equation they understood, drew the only conclusion that equation permitted. It was during this period, mid-October, the ground hard with frost each morning, softening by a daily rhythm of freezing, thawing that made the earth feel indecisive, that Gideon Stroud did something no one in Ashvale expected, least of all himself. He walked to Vesper's cabin on a Wednesday afternoon, alone this time, no witnesses, no official purpose. He did not approach the tunnel entrance or the cabin's front door. He climbed the slope behind the cabin, a 15-minute walk through scrub pine, loose scree, the dry stalks of summer wildflowers now brown, brittle, until he reached the stone chimney Vesper had built at the top of the vertical shaft. He had seen it from a distance during his previous visit, but had dismissed it as another symptom of her delusion. Now, standing beside it, he examined it with professional eyes. The chimney was well built, he could not deny that. The stone selection was sound, the mortaring competent, the proportions reasonable for a 20-foot draw. But the base where the chimney met the hillside showed a structural weakness he recognized instantly. The footing stones were too shallow, set on a layer of decomposed granite that would shift under the weight of heavy snowpack. A Montana winter could drop 4 feet of wet snow on this slope. The chimney would lean, crack at the base, possibly topple. If it toppled, the system's draw would collapse. Without draw, smoke would reverse through the tunnel, fill the cabin. The woman, the boy. Stroud stood there for several minutes, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was not reconsidering his judgment of the system. He was certain it would fail. But failure due to a structural deficiency in the chimney was a different matter than failure due to flawed principles. If the chimney fell because of poor footing, people might say that Gideon Stroud, who had seen it, who had the expertise to identify the problem, had allowed it to happen. The distinction mattered to him. Professional negligence was a stain that no amount of certainty could wash out. He descended the slope, gathered tools from his workshop, a pry bar, a mason's trowel, a bag of the limestone mortar he mixed himself from a recipe his own father had taught him in Ohio. He climbed back up. He spent the next 3 hours resetting the chimney's base stones, digging deeper footings, packing them with gravel for drainage, remortaring the first 4 courses with material that would hold against frost heave, snow load, the patient, destructive chemistry of freeze-thaw cycles. Vesper found him there when she emerged from the tunnel in late afternoon. She stood at the base of the slope, looking up at the man who had publicly declared her a danger to her own child, now kneeling beside her chimney with mortar on his hands. Neither spoke for a long moment. The silence held a texture different from their previous encounter, not confrontational, not charged with the electricity of competing certainties. This was the silence of 2 people who understood structures, standing in the presence of a structure that needed repair. Vesper's voice carried up the slope, stripped of everything except the question itself. Why? Stroud did not look up from his work. His answer was directed at the stones, at the mortar, at the craft that was the only language he fully trusted. Because if this chimney falls on your boy in a snowstorm, it won't be your engineering that killed him. It'll be my negligence. He finished the repairs as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. Climbing down, he passed within 10 feet of the tunnel entrance, the same opening he had called a grave 6 weeks earlier. He paused. The tunnel's mouth was different now from what he remembered. The lining stones were more carefully set, the timber bracing more sophisticated, the floor smoother. He could see 8 or 9 feet into the passage before the darkness took over. The work visible in those 8 feet was precise, methodical, patient. It was the work of someone who understood what they were doing. He did not enter the tunnel. He did not comment on what he saw. But his pace down the hill toward town was slower than his pace up, the stride of a man carrying something he had not brought with him. 3 days after the chimney repair, on a Saturday evening when the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season, Vesper performed the system's first real test. She built a fire in the new firebox, not the tentative test burn of 3 weeks ago, but a full operational fire using seasoned pine split to the specific dimensions she had calculated from Elroy's notes. Small, no thicker than her wrist, stacked vertically in the tall, narrow combustion chamber. She lit it from the bottom. The effect was immediate, dramatic. The vertical firebox, insulated on all sides by dense stone, created a combustion environment so hot that the wood burned with a clean, focused intensity she had never seen in a conventional hearth. No lazy smoking flames licking sideways at half-consumed logs. This was a pillar of fire, contained, directed, consuming the wood so completely that the smoke itself ignited secondary combustion, turning the exhaust from thick gray to thin, almost transparent vapor. The superheated gas, hotter than a conventional fireplace could produce, because the insulated firebox reflected its own energy back into the burn zone, hit the tunnel entrance behind the firebox with force. She could hear the draw engage, the distant chimney on the hillside pulling like a bellows, creating the suction that drove the entire system. The gas entered the tunnel. The stone lining began its work. She fed the fire for 2 hours, then she let it die. There was no immediate wave of warmth. A conventional fireplace delivers heat the way a shout delivers sound, sudden, loud, brief, leaving silence in its wake. Vesper's system delivered heat the way the earth delivers spring, slowly, from beneath, from within, through a process so gradual that you notice the result long after the cause had finished its work. 20 minutes after the fire died, the back wall of the cabin, the stone wall that formed the barrier between the living space, the tunnel-riddled hillside behind, changed temperature. Not dramatically, not in a way that a casual observer would notice, but Vesper, who had pressed her palm against that wall every night for 6 months, who knew its cold-weather personality the way she knew the sound of her own breathing, felt the difference instantly. The stone, which in previous winters had radiated cold into the room with the indifference of a glacier, was neutral, neither cold nor warm, just present, as if it had forgotten its allegiance to winter. 30 minutes later, the granite held a gentle heat that came from deep inside. Vesper moved through the cabin, checking each surface the way a doctor checks a patient's vital signs. The floor, wooden planks laid over bare earth, over the clay layer that sat atop the tunnel's first 10 feet, was no longer the source of biting cold that had forced Everett to wear 2 pairs of socks to bed the previous winter. The air in the room was different too. In previous winters, the air inside the cabin had been a battlefield, hot near the fire, freezing near the walls, a constant turbulent circulation of competing temperatures that created drafts, eddies, pockets of cold that ambushed you when you moved from one part of the room to another. Now the air was still, uniform, without the massive draft of a conventional fireplace sucking cold air through every crack. The cabin had achieved something it had never achieved before: equilibrium. Everett was sitting on the floor near the back wall, his carved wooden soldiers arranged in formation on the planks. He had been playing there for 20 minutes, a location he would never have chosen during the previous winter. The back wall had been the coldest spot in the cabin, the place where frost formed on the inside surface. Now he sat there, cross-legged, absorbed in whatever campaign his soldiers were waging. His shoes were off. She had not noticed him removing them. Then the awareness arrived, traveling from his feet to his face, rearranging his features into an expression she had not seen since before Elroy died. "Floor's warm, Mama." 3 words, the smallest sentence, the largest proof. Vesper crossed the room. She knelt beside him, placed her palm flat on the wooden planks. The warmth rose through the wood into her hands, steady, patient, unmistakable. Not the aggressive heat of fire, the deep, slow warmth of earth that had been asked to remember had agreed. She pressed her palm against the stone wall behind Everett's head. The granite radiated a gentle heat that had depth, that came from the core, that would take hours to dissipate. The cycle was sustainable, repeatable, reliable. Something turned over inside her chest, not relief exactly, not triumph. Recognition. The feeling you get when a key slides into a lock you were not sure you had the right key for, the tumblers engaging with a sound so small it might be imagined. The fire had been dead for 45 minutes, the cabin was warm. 4 miles away, in the center of Ashvale, Gideon Stroud was stacking wood against the east wall of his house, arranging the logs with the geometric precision of a man who measures everything, even his firewood, by the standards of structural integrity. His pile was the largest in town, 12 cords of seasoned pine, split to uniform thickness, stacked in alternating layers for airflow, covered with a tarpaulin he had sewn himself from surplus canvas. It was a monument to the principle he had lived by for 30 years. Strength is sufficiency, sufficiency is strength. Enough wood meant enough heat meant survival. The equation was simple, proven, unassailable. He had never questioned it because it had never failed him. Or rather, it had never failed him badly enough to force a question. But that Saturday evening, alone in his workshop after the rest of the household was asleep, Gideon Stroud did something that contradicted everything he had publicly declared about the Hale woman's tunnel. He built a model. It was small, absurdly small, compared to the real thing, a firebox made from scrapstone, no bigger than a bread loaf, a horizontal channel 8 feet long, lined with flat rocks from the pile behind his workshop. A short vertical stack at the far end, barely 4 feet high, cobbled together from leftover chimney stones. The whole assembly sat on the dirt floor of the workshop like a child's toy, crude, hastily constructed, bearing no resemblance to the meticulous engineering of Vesper's system. He lit a fire in the small firebox, fed it scraps of pine, dry bark, a handful of wood shavings. The flames were pathetic, a miniature blaze that would not have warmed a dog. But size was not the point. The question was direction. Would the smoke travel the 8-foot horizontal path, or would it reverse, pouring back through the firebox into the workshop? He watched. The smoke rose in the firebox, hit the ceiling of the small stone chamber, curled toward the horizontal channel, hesitated, then moved, pulled by the draw of the short vertical stack, sucked through the channel with a steady, visible flow that left no doubt about the physics involved. The smoke chose the path. Forward through the stone, upward at the far end, into the night air. Stroud stood over the model for 10 minutes, watching the flow, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. Then he knelt. He placed his palm on the stones lining the horizontal channel, 3 feet from the firebox, where no direct heat from the flames could reach. The stones held heat they had no business holding, not dramatically changed, but measurably, undeniably warmer than the workshop floor around them. The fire's exhaust traveling through the channel had deposited thermal energy into the stone lining. The principle was functioning. At 8 with a pathetic fire, in a crude model built from scraps, the principle was functioning. He removed his hand. He sat on the workshop floor, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the miniature system, still drawing, still flowing, still depositing heat into rock. The fire died. The flow continued for several minutes on residual heat, the vertical stack's draw pulling the last warm air from the cooling channel. Then silence. The stones stayed warm for another hour. He checked them twice, pressing his palm flat, measuring with his skin what he did not possess instruments to measure. Cooling, yes, but slowly, far more slowly than air would cool, than wood would cool, than any material he routinely worked with would cool. The stone was releasing the stored heat at its own pace, on its own schedule, according to laws that operate below the threshold of human impatience. Gideon Stroud sat in his dark workshop for a long time after the stones finally cooled. He did not dismantle the model, he did not go to bed. He sat with the knowledge the way a man sits with a wound, aware of it, unwilling to touch it, knowing that acknowledging it would require a response he was not yet prepared to give. Because if the Hale woman was right, if heat could be stored in stone, released slowly, used to warm a living space with a fraction of the fuel a conventional fireplace required, then the 14 houses he had built in Ashvale, the 14 families whose chimneys he had laid, whose fireplaces he had designed with such pride, such confidence, such absolute certainty that he was giving them the best technology available, those 14 families had been burning 3 times the wood they needed, waking twice a night to feed fires that devoured their fuel supply like a beast that could never be satisfied, freezing in the corners of rooms that should have been warm, sending their children to bed in coats because the heat from the fireplace could not reach the far wall. For 10 years, 14 families. Because Gideon Stroud had never questioned the equation. He went home. He said nothing to Ruth Ann. He said nothing to Lisbeth, who was sleeping in the bed closest to the fireplace, as she always did, because the bed against the far wall was too cold for a child. He lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the fire consume another log, listening to the cold press against the walls, listening to the sound of a world that had just shifted beneath his feet while everyone else slept. The knowledge was a stone in his stomach. He carried it through October, through November, through the first serious snowfall in early December. He carried it to the general store where Floyd Dench held court, to the timber yard where men discussed the winter forecast, to Sunday gatherings where the community reinforced its shared certainties with the ritual repetition of agreed-upon truths. The Hale woman was a fool. The tunnel was a death trap. Winter would prove them right. Stroud said nothing to contradict the consensus. He nodded when others nodded. He shook his head when others shook theirs. The models sat in his workshop, a small monument to a truth he had verified with his own hands, then buried under the floorboards of his professional pride. November, December, the cold tightened its grip on Ironback Ridge in increments, each day a fraction colder than the last, the way a vise closes imperceptibly until the pressure becomes pain. The creek froze, the ground froze. The world contracted to the space between hearth and bed. In Vesper's cabin, a rhythm established itself. Each morning she lit the firebox. 1 hour of focused, efficient burned small logs, wrist-thick, consumed completely in the superheated combustion chamber. Each evening the same. Between those 2 fires, the cabin maintained its warmth from the thermal mass of the tunnel, the hillside, the granite wall at her back. The floor stayed warm, the air stayed still. The cold outside, visible through the frost-coated window as a blue-white stillness that killed everything it touched, was a fact observed rather than a condition endured. Everett's world expanded within the cabin's small boundaries. The previous winter, his existence had been a tight orbit around the fireplace, eat near the fire, sleep near the fire, play near the fire. The rest of the cabin abandoned to the cold like rooms in a house slowly being repossessed. Now the entire space was habitable. He read on the floor by the back wall. He played soldiers near the front door. He sat at the table without wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. The cabin had become a climate, not a compromise. January arrived without announcement. One morning the temperature was 12 below zero. The next morning it was 20 below. The third morning the thermometer outside Floyd Dench's store, the only one in Ashvale, read 32 below zero, a number so extreme that Dench walked out, tapped the glass, waited, tapped again. The mercury did not move. The cold was not fluctuating. It was settling the way a predator settles into position before the final patient work of killing begins. The old-timers would later call it the winter of the Blue Stillness. The name came from the quality of the light, a strange azure cast that the world took on under a sky scoured clean by a wind so cold it had driven every cloud to lower latitudes. The sun rose each morning into this empty blue vault, producing light without heat, illuminating a landscape that had been transformed into something alien, hostile, beautiful in the way that a knife blade is beautiful. Trees in the forest exploded, their sap freezing, expanding with a sound that carried for miles, a sharp percussive crack that sounded like a rifle shot, like a bone breaking, like the earth itself protesting conditions it had not agreed to. For 3 weeks the temperature did not rise above 30 below. It fluctuated between 30-40, occasionally touching 45 below zero on the clearest nights, when the sky was a dome of black ice pierced by stars so bright they seemed like puncture wounds in the fabric of the universe, leaking cold white fire. Nothing moved in Ashvale. The street was empty. The horses stood in their stalls with blankets tied over their bodies, heads down, breathing steam, conserving energy with the stoic patience of animals that understand winter in ways their owners never will. Smoke rose from every chimney in town, thick white columns in the still air, rising straight up for hundreds of feet before dispersing, the visual signature of fireplaces working at maximum capacity, consuming wood at rates that turned autumn's abundance into January's emergency. In Gideon Stroud's house, the finest structure in the settlement, with its dovetailed log corners, its double-thick chinking, its massive stone fireplace designed to be the heart of a home that would stand for generations, the siege was losing. The fire roared. Stroud fed it with the steady mechanical rhythm of a man performing a task he understood was futile but could not stop performing. Every 4 hours, day through night, he rose from whatever he was doing, crossed to the woodpile outside the back door, a journey of 12 feet that at 40 below was enough to burn exposed skin, to freeze the moisture in his nostrils into tiny needles of ice, loaded his arms with logs, returned, fed the fire. The heat reached perhaps 8 feet from the hearth. Beyond that radius, the cabin belonged to winter. Frost coated the inside surfaces of the walls in delicate crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful if they were not evidence of a losing battle. The far corners of the main room held temperatures barely above freezing. The beds against the side walls, one for Ruth Ann, one for Lisbeth, one for the 2 boys, were piled with every blanket, every coat, every piece of fabric the household possessed. Ruth Ann Stroud managed the crisis with the grim efficiency of a woman who had survived frontier winters before, though none like this. She kept the children in the circle of warmth around the hearth during the day, organized meals that required minimum time away from the fire, maintained a rotation of hot stones wrapped in cloth tucked into the beds to pre-warm them before the children were sent to sleep. Her face, lit by the firelight, held no complaint. Complaint required energy she could not spare. Lisbeth, 9 years old, had drawn inward. She sat closest to the fire, wrapped in a quilt her grandmother had sewn in Ohio, shivering despite direct heat, her body struggling to maintain temperature in a room where the ambient air 10 feet from the fire hovered near freezing. She was not sick, but she was cold in the deep, persistent way that exhausts a body's reserves, that turns every meal into fuel burned immediately for warmth rather than stored for growth, that makes sleep shallow, fitful, interrupted by the involuntary contractions of muscles trying to generate heat through motion. Stroud watched his daughter. He watched his woodpile, day 10 of the freeze. The pile, which in October had seemed inexhaustible, 12 cords, the largest in Ashvale, a monument to his philosophy of sufficiency, had been reduced by half. The mathematics were no longer abstract. At the current rate of consumption, he had fuel for 12 more days. The freeze showed no sign of breaking. The sky remained empty, blue, pitiless. Day 14, he began burning furniture. A chair from the kitchen, one he had built himself in his first year at Ashvale, its joints dovetailed with the precision that was his signature. He carried it to the fireplace, stood holding it for a moment, then placed it in the flames. The chair burned fast, dry, seasoned wood, the kind of fuel a fireplace loves, consuming it with an eagerness that felt personal. Day 16, a small table. Day 17, the boards from a spare bed frame, disassembled with hands that knew exactly where every joint, every peg, every carefully fitted connection was located because he had made them all. Unbuilding his own work, feeding his craft to the fire that his craft had failed to contain. Day 18, he burned the tool chest, a pine box that had carried his mason's trowels, his chisels, his levels from Ohio to Montana. The tools themselves he saved, laying them on the floor near the hearth. The box, emptied of its purpose, became fuel for the system it had served. Ruth Ann watched him feed it to the fire. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the fire was not already saying in its roaring, consuming, wasteful way. Day 19, the woodpile was gone. The furniture that could be spared was gone. What remained in the cabin was structural: the table they ate on, the beds they slept in, the shelves that held their food. To burn these would be to dismantle the architecture of daily life itself, to reduce existence to a single function: warmth at any cost. Stroud sat at the table he had built when he married Ruth Ann, the table where they had eaten every meal for 7 years, where Lisbeth had learned her letters, where his 2 boys had carved their initials into the underside when they thought no one was watching. He placed his palms flat on its surface. The wood was cold. Everything in the house was cold except the circle immediately around the fire, a shrinking island of survivable temperature in an ocean of freezing air. He looked at Lisbeth, curled in her quilt by the hearth, shivering in her sleep. He looked at Ruth Ann, awake, watching him with eyes that held no accusation, just the steady, enduring gaze of a woman waiting for her husband to do whatever he was going to do next. The knowledge from the workshop rose in his chest like bile. He had known since October. He had known the warm stones in his model, the steady draw through the 8-foot channel, the principle verified by his own hands, confirmed by his own senses. He had known, buried it under pride, carried it through 3 months of deepening cold, while his family burned their possessions for heat that lasted minutes before the cold reclaimed the room. You cannot burn what you know to keep warm. The thought arrived in the language of his craft, a structural observation, an engineering truth. Knowledge was not fuel. It did not go away when you refused to use it. It sat in the foundation, bearing weight whether you acknowledged it or not. He had tried to ignore it, to build his winter on the same old plans, the same old certainty. The foundation had held his knowledge of the Hale system, had not cracked, had not crumbled, had not disappeared. But the structure above it, his pride, his professional identity, his position as the man who knew how to build that structure, was collapsing around his family in real time. He made his decision at 3 in the morning, the hour when the fire had burned low enough that the cold began its advance from the walls inward, reclaiming territory it had been temporarily pushed back from. The decision was not heroic, it was mechanical. A man whose current system has failed, turning to the only alternative he knows exists, driven not by conversion but by the biological imperative to keep his daughter warm. He would go to the Hale cabin. Not to save the woman he was certain she was dead, had been dead for days. Her small woodpile, inadequate by every standard he recognized, must have run out a week ago. The cabin would be cold, dark, the woman frozen in her bed with the boy beside her. It was a thought that brought him no satisfaction, only a grim, hollow recognition that being right about someone's method was no comfort when your own method was failing at the same speed. Her woodpile would still be there. Frozen, snow-covered, but burnable. Dead people did not need firewood, his living daughter did. He dressed in every layer he owned. 2 shirts, a wool sweater Ruth Ann had knitted, a canvas coat lined with rabbit fur, a second coat over that, an old army greatcoat he had traded for at a supply post 3 years ago. Wool scarf wrapped around his face until only his eyes showed, gloves inside mittens, boots packed with straw for insulation. He opened the back door. The cold entered the cabin like a living thing, not a gust, not a draft, but a presence, a physical entity that displaced the meager warmth of the dying fire, filling the space it vacated with a temperature so far below human tolerance that his exposed skin, the strip between scarf hat, went numb in seconds. The distance to the Hale cabin was 100 yards. In summer, a walk of less than 2 minutes. In this cold, under this sky, through snow that had compacted into a surface hard enough to walk on but treacherous enough to punish every misstep, 100 yards was a journey. The snow squeaked under his boots, a dry, alien sound that only extreme cold produces. The crystalline structure of the ice too rigid for the normal compression that makes snow quiet. Each breath through the scarf was a negotiation, the fabric warm enough to prevent his lungs from seizing, thin enough to allow oxygen through. The air itself felt granular, as if the cold had given it texture, weight, substance. He walked. 50 yards. 70. He could see the cabin now, a dark shape against the darker hillside, its outlines softened by snow accumulated on the roof, drifted against the walls. He looked for the chimney, the main chimney, the one above the firebox. No smoke. Of course no smoke. She was the dead. 80 yards. 90. He was close enough now to see the front of the cabin, the small window, the door, the snow piled against the threshold. He expected darkness. He expected the blank black rectangle of a window with no light behind it, the vacancy that distinguishes an occupied home from an abandoned one. The window held light. He stopped, his boots locked into the snow, his breath escaping through the scarf in small rhythmic plumes, continued without him, his body breathing while his mind stuttered, recalculated, crashed against a fact it could not process. Warm, yellow light. The color of a lantern, the color of habitation, unflickering, the light of a room that was occupied, functional, alive. He stared at the window for a long time. The cold worked on his exposed skin with patient, methodical cruelty, but he did not move. The light was impossible. The light contradicted every prediction he had made, every judgment he had rendered, every comforting certainty he had wrapped around himself like the coats he was wearing. The light said, someone is home, someone is warm, someone survived a cold that was killing his family in the best-built house in Ashvale. He took the last 10 steps to the cabin door. He raised his gloved fist. He hesitated, a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but contained the entire weight of 6 months of certainty, 6 months of public pronouncements, 6 months of building consensus around the proposition that this woman was a fool. Then he knocked. The sound was flat, absorbed the cold, swallowed by the silence, but inside he heard movement, footsteps, the scrape of a bar being lifted. The door opened. Vesper Hale stood in the doorway. She was wearing a wool dress. Not wrapped in furs, not huddled under blankets, not shivering in the desperate posture of a woman clinging to the last margins of survival. A wool dress. Behind her the cabin glowed with lamplight. Behind her the air was clear, no smoke, no haze. Behind her, on the floor, Everett Hale sat cross-legged in his shirt sleeves, wooden soldiers arranged in a formation that suggested a boy who had been playing for hours, undisturbed, unhurried, at peace. The heat came through the open door like a hand reaching for him, not the scorching, aggressive blast of a fireplace working at full capacity. This was something else, a warmth that had no visible source, no roaring fire to explain it, no logical origin in any system Gideon Stroud had ever built, maintained, understood. It enveloped him. It pressed against his frozen clothing, his frozen face, his frozen certainty, with the gentle, irresistible pressure of something that had been waiting a long time to make its point. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. The cold stayed outside, separated from him by 4 inches of log wall, a layer of chinking, the same inadequate, crumbling chinking he had noted during his first visit, a barrier that should have been laughably insufficient against a 40-below night. The cabin was warm. The whole cabin, not just the area near the hearth, the entire room, corner to corner, floor to ceiling, wall to wall. The temperature was uniform, pervasive, structural. It came from everywhere. It came from nowhere he could identify. His eyes found the firebox. A bed of coals glowed in the small vertical combustion chamber, the remnants of a fire that had obviously burned out hours ago. No flames, no fresh fuel. A conventional fireplace with coals this far gone would have surrendered the room to the cold an hour ago, 2 hours ago. The temperature outside was 42 below zero. The walls of this cabin were no thicker than the walls of his own. The chinking was worse. By every measure he possessed, this room should have been a freezer. He was standing in the warmest room in Ashvale. Gideon Stroud did not speak. Words required a framework, and his framework had just collapsed. He stood in the middle of the Hale cabin with melting frost dripping from his scarf onto the wooden floor, his eyes moving from the dying coals to the clear air to the boy in his shirt sleeves, cataloging impossibilities the way he had once cataloged the flaws in Vesper's tunnel. He crossed to the back wall. He pulled off his mitten, then the glove beneath it, exposing a hand still numb from the walk. He pressed his bare palm flat against the granite. The warmth that met his skin was not shallow, not temporary. It had roots. It came from somewhere deep inside the mass, radiating outward through inches of dense crystal. He pressed harder, spreading his fingers, feeling the heat travel into his frozen joints. His hand, which had built 14 chimneys, which knew stone the way a musician knows an instrument, was reading a language it had never been taught to read. He dropped to one knee. He placed his palm on the floorboards. The warmth was there too, under the table, near the door, along the base of the walls. The entire floor was a radiator, heated from beneath by a fire that had burned out hours ago. The truth arrived not as a thought but as a physical sensation, a shifting of weight in his chest, the feeling of a foundation settling into a position it should have occupied all along. He looked up at her from his knee, his face weathered by 3 decades of pride, hardened by the professional confidence that had made him. Ashvale's master builder was undergoing a transformation that felt, from the inside, like something breaking, not shattering. Breaking the way ice breaks on a river in spring, a fracturing that releases what was frozen beneath. His voice, when it finally came, held the weight of everything he had built his life upon, now revealed as a monument to a flawed foundation. "I built shields." The words scraped out of him, rough, quiet. "You built a source." Vesper did not answer immediately. She stood a few feet away, watching him kneel on her warm floor, her expression holding none of the triumph she had every right to feel. There was no vindication in her eyes, no satisfaction at the sight of the man who had called her mad now genuflecting before the proof of her sanity. There was only a deep, weary recognition, the look of someone who had won a war she had never wanted to fight, against an enemy that had never been the man in front of her. "The cold was always the enemy, Mr. Stroud. Not you. You were just standing in front of it, telling me it couldn't be beaten." He remained on his knee. The confession that came next was not one he had planned, not one that desperation had driven him to prepare. It emerged because the moment demanded a truth larger than the one already exposed, because kneeling on her floor with his hand still carrying the memory of her warm stone, he could no longer carry the weight of what he had hidden. "I knew," the words fell into the still air of the cabin. "In October, after I fixed the chimney, I built a model, a small one, 8 feet, stones from behind my workshop. I lit a fire in it." He stopped, forcing himself to continue, each word a stone removed from a wall he had spent months building around his own complicity. "The smoke traveled. The stones held the heat. I put my hand on them, the same as I just did on your wall. I felt it. I knew you were right." The silence that followed was different from any silence between them before. It was not the charged standoff of their first confrontation, not the wordless understanding of the chimney repair. It was the silence of a wound laid open, waiting to see whether it would be met with salt or with something else. Vesper's face did not change, but something moved behind her eyes, not anger, not the vindication he might have expected, but a kind of grave calculation, a weighing of what this admission cost him against what it revealed about him. Why? The single word, the same one she had asked from the space of the hillside in October, but it meant something larger now. Not "Why did you help?" "Why did you know, then say nothing?" Stroud looked at his own hand, the hand that had verified the truth, then buried it. "Because if you were right, then I was wrong." His voice cracked on the last word, 30 years of certainty splitting along a fault line he had refused to acknowledge. "Not wrong about you. Wrong about everything. 14 houses, 14 families. 10 years of building the same fireplace, the same, telling every one of them it was the best they could have. Watching their children sleep in coats. Telling myself that was just winter, that was just how it was." He finally rose from his knees slowly, his joints protesting the cold that still lived in them. He faced her fully, no longer the master builder delivering a verdict, but a man who had discovered that his life's work rested on a mistake. "I could admit you were right, or I could keep being the man who knew how to build. I couldn't be both, so I chose to be blind." He looked toward the door, toward the 100 yards of killing cold that separated this warm room from his own failing house. "And tonight my daughter is shivering by a fire that's eating my furniture, because I chose my pride over what my own hands told me was true." Vesper was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a tree cracked in the forest, the sharp report of sap freezing, a sound that had become the winter's constant punctuation. When she spoke, her words held no forgiveness but no condemnation either. Just the flat, level truth that was the only currency she had ever trafficked in. "You built the best you knew how with what you understood. Now you understand more. The question isn't whether you were wrong. Everyone's wrong until they aren't. The question is what you do with the being wrong once you can't unsee it." The words settled into him with the weight of the warm stone at his back. He had come to this cabin expecting to scavenge from the dead. He was leaving with something he had not known he needed, not fuel, not warmth, but a map out of a certainty that had nearly killed his family. Vesper moved to the table. She took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the firebox, pulled a sheet of paper from a small stack she kept for Everett's letters. She began to draw. Not the technical diagrams from Elroy's notebook, dense with measurements, but simple shapes, the essential architecture rendered in lines a child could follow. The tall, narrow firebox, the long horizontal tunnel, the vertical chimney at the far end. As she drew, she explained not in the vocabulary of thermodynamics, which she did not possess, but in the earthy, practical language of a miner's wife who had learned the earth's secrets through her hands. "You make the fire burn hot and fast so it eats its own smoke. Then you make the heat walk a long road before you let it go home to the sky. On that road you make it pay a toll. Every step it pays the stone, it pays the earth." Stroud watched the drawing take shape, his builder's mind mapping the simple diagram onto the failed architecture of his own house, seeing for the first time how the two systems differed not in degree but in kind. His fireplace shouted heat into a room, then let it escape up a chimney, dragging cold air in behind it. Vesper's system whispered heat into stone, then held it there, releasing it slowly, asking the earth to become a partner in the work of keeping a family alive. And the earth doesn't forget. Vesper set down the charcoal. It holds the warmth for you. It keeps you safe. All you have to do is stop fighting it long enough to let it work. She crossed to the corner where a small stack of firewood sat, her own supply, the modest pile that Ashvale had mocked all autumn, now revealed as more than sufficient for a system that sipped fuel where conventional fireplaces gorged. She gathered an armful. Not much, perhaps a dozen split logs, but enough for a family to survive a single brutal night while a father figured out what to do next. She held out the wood. "Take this. It'll get you through tonight." Then she picked up Elroy's notebook from the shelf where it lived, its cover worn soft by her husband's years of handling, by her own months of study. She placed it on top of the firewood in Stroud's arms. "And take this. Read it tonight after your family's asleep. Everything's in there, the shoring, the airflow, the heat exchange. My husband spent his life underground learning it. It's the only thing of his I have left." She met his eyes. "Bring it back when you understand it well enough that you don't need it anymore." Stroud looked at the notebook, then at the woman. The generosity struck him harder than any accusation could have. He had spent months building consensus against her. He had threatened to withhold the community's help. He had knelt on her floor, confessed that he had known the truth all along, said nothing, let her stand alone against the collective judgment of the town. She was handing him the most precious object she owned, along with the wood that might keep his daughter warm. "Mrs. Hale," his voice failed. He had no framework for receiving this, no more than he'd had for understanding the warmth of her stone. "Go home, Mr. Stroud." Her voice was gentle now, the gentleness of exhaustion rather than tenderness. "Your daughter's cold. The wood won't stay warm in your arms forever." He went. The 100 yards back to his house passed differently than the 100 yards out, the cold no less severe, but the destination transformed. He carried the firewood against his chest, Elroy Hale's notebook balanced on top, one hand pressed over it to keep it from sliding into the snow. The frozen world around him had not changed. The blue stillness still held the valley in its killing grip, the stars still burned like puncture wounds in the black dome overhead, the trees still cracked in the forest with their rifle shot reports. But something in the man walking through it had shifted permanently. He fed his family's fire with Vesper's wood that night. The logs burned clean, the seasoned pine giving up its heat to the room the way it always had, briefly, wastefully, most of it vanishing up the chimney while cold air poured in through the walls to replace it. But it was enough. Lisbeth stopped shivering. Ruth Ann slept. The two boys, buried under their blankets against the far wall, breathed the slow, even breath of children who were, for one night, warm enough. Gideon Stroud did not sleep. He sat by the fire with Elroy Hale's notebook open on his knees, reading by firelight the accumulated wisdom of a man he had never met, a Pennsylvania coal miner who had died 6 months ago in the cold that Stroud's own methods could not defeat. The technical passages he understood immediately, the shoring angles, the ventilation principles, the mathematics of draft. His builder's mind absorbed them the way dry ground absorbs rain, but it was not the technical passages that kept him awake until dawn. Scattered through the diagrams, in the margins, at the bottoms of pages, were Elroy Hale's thoughts. Not instructions, reflections. The private philosophy of a man who had spent his life in the dark, learning to trust the earth around him. One passage stopped Stroud cold. He read it once, then again, then a third time, the firelight flickering across the faded pencil script. The thing a miner fears most isn't the cave-in, it's the day he stops trusting the rock. The rock isn't your enemy. The rock is the most patient ally in the world. It'll hold you up, keep you warm, guard your life, but only if you learn to listen to it instead of fighting it. Stroud lowered the notebook. He stared into the fire, into the wasteful, roaring flames that were, at that moment, sending most of their heat straight up a chimney into a sky that did not need warming. He had spent 30 years teaching men how to build. He had never once in all that time learned to listen to the earth. The dawn came gray, then pale gold, the sun climbing into the same empty blue vault it had risen into for 19 mornings, but on the 20th morning the wind shifted. It was slight at first, a change in the direction of the smoke rising from Ashvale's chimneys, a softening in the brutal edge of the air. By midday the temperature had climbed to 20 below, by evening 10 below. The freeze was not over, but it had loosened its grip, the Arctic mass that had settled over the territory finally beginning to move, pushed east by warmer air flowing up from the south. Within 3 days the temperature rose above zero for the first time in nearly a month. The winter of the Blue Stillness was breaking. Gideon Stroud did not return to his old ways. He came back to Vesper's cabin not as a skeptic, not as a scout, but as something he had never been in his life, an apprentice. He arrived on the first morning the temperature rose above freezing, Elroy's notebook in his hands, his face carrying the particular humility of a man who had spent his life teaching, now prepared to learn. Vesper let him in. Stroud placed the notebook on the table. I read it, every page, twice. I don't understand it well enough yet to give it back, but I understand enough to know I've been building tombs for warmth and calling them houses. He paused. I want to learn how to build a source. Will you teach me? Vesper looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Everett, who had lowered his book, watching the exchange with those eyes that missed nothing. She looked back at Stroud. I'll teach you what my husband taught me. But you'll bring your own knowledge to it, the stone setting, the timber framing, the things you've spent 30 years learning. What I know about heat, what you know about building, neither one is enough alone. What followed was a partnership no one in Ashvale could have predicted. Through the remaining weeks of winter, then into the mud-thick weeks of spring, Vesper Hale and Gideon Stroud refined the system that had saved her and her son. She brought the principles: heat exchange, thermal mass, efficient combustion, the patient logic of storing warmth in earth. He brought the craft, the structural knowledge that could turn her hand-dug tunnel into something faster to build, more durable, better suited to the range of homes across the settlement. They learned to construct the heat exchange tunnels from kiln-fired stone tiles instead of hand-laid creek rock, a technique that cut construction time by more than half while improving the heat transfer. The smooth tile surface conducting warmth into the surrounding earth more efficiently than irregular stone. Stroud, drawing on his mason's knowledge, designed a way to route the tunnel beneath a stone bench inside the cabin, a broad, flat platform of mortared rock through which the hot exhaust passed on its journey to the chimney, warming the bench itself so thoroughly that it stayed warm for 18 hours after the fire went out. A place to sleep. A place where a child could press his back against warm stone through the coldest night and never shiver. They called it the Hale Hearth. The name was Stroud's choice, insisted upon over Vesper's quiet objection that the principles came from her husband, from the coal mines of Pennsylvania, where a man had learned to trust the earth. The principles came from your husband, Stroud agreed. But the courage to build it here alone, with the whole town calling you mad, that was you. It carries your name because you're the one who dug the first tunnel while everyone, including me, told you it was a grave. It was the closest thing to an apology he could construct, and they both knew it. Not the words "I'm sorry," those were too small, too easy, incapable of bearing the weight of what he owed her. Instead, her name on the thing itself, her name in every cabin it warmed, an apology written not in speech but in the permanent architecture of 100 warm rooms. Stroud retrofitted his own house, first tore out the massive stone hearth he had been so proud of, the fireplace that had failed his family during the Blue Stillness, replaced it with a Hale hearth built to the refined design. The following winter, when the cold returned less severe than the Blue Stillness, but hard enough to test any system, the Stroud house stayed warm on a fraction of the wood it had once devoured. Lisbeth slept in the bed against the far wall, the one that had been too cold for a child the winter before, now heated from the stone beneath her rather than the fire across the room. The transformation of Ashvale's opinion did not happen all at once. Certainty, once built, does not collapse in a day any more than a stone wall does. It came apart the way Stroud's own certainty had, slowly, one verified fact at a time, one warm room at a time. Floyd Dench was the first crack in the consensus he had spent the autumn constructing. Stroud went to the general store, the same store where the stories of the Mad Widow had been kindled, and told the truth loud enough for the customers present to hear. My house near froze during the Blue Stillness. Best built place in this town, and I was burning furniture to keep my daughter warm. Mrs. Hale's cabin stayed warm the whole time on a woodpile you all laughed at. He let that settle. I was wrong about her. I want that on the record, said out loud in front of witnesses. She wasn't mad, she was right. Dench, whose livelihood ran on information, found himself spreading a story that reversed the one he had circulated all autumn. 3 families came to see for themselves before winter's end. Vesper let them in, not to lecture them, but simply to let them stand in the warmth, press their hands against the stone wall, sit on the floor without shivering, feel with their own bodies what words could not convey. Blythe, who had never joined the chorus of judgment, who had nodded to Vesper through the loneliest months when a nod was the only human contact the town would risk, became the bridge between Vesper and the rest of Ashvale. She brought other women to the cabin. She spoke of Vesper's ingenuity at gatherings where, months before, she had held her tongue while others spoke of the widow's broken mind. But the true reversal came in the settlement's single meeting hall, on an evening in early spring when the men of Ashvale gathered to discuss the coming season's building projects. Gideon Stroud stood before the men who had followed his lead for a decade, who had trusted his judgment on every structure in the town, who had nodded along when he pronounced the Hale Tunnel a death trap. He faced them, this man whose authority had never before been questioned, and said the thing that authority is least equipped to say. I was wrong. For 10 years I built you the best fireplaces I knew how to build. They were the wrong design. They waste 3 times the wood they should. They pull cold into your homes as fast as they push heat out, and they nearly killed my own family this winter. Mrs. Hale figured out something I couldn't see, something I was too proud to admit even after I proved it to myself. I want to learn to build it right. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of a community recalibrating everything it had believed about the woman on the edge of town, about the man who had led them, about the nature of certainty itself. Then Putnam, the old harness mender who had stood as witness to Stroud's original condemnation, nodded, a single slow inclination of his gray head. Then Briley, the timber claim man, then another. Then the whole room, the collective judgment that had isolated Vesper Hale for 6 months dissolving into something new, not admiration exactly, but respect. The grudging, hard-won respect that frontier people reserved for those who had been proven right by winter itself, the only judge whose verdict they truly trusted. The snow finished melting in April. The creek ran high with meltwater. The valley of Ironback Ridge, which had spent 3 weeks encased in killing blue ice, exploded into the violent green of a mountain spring. The first Hale hearth built for another family went into the cabin of a young couple who had lost most of their winter wood to the Blue Stillness. Stroud led the construction. Vesper oversaw the critical elements, the firebox proportions, the tunnel gradient, the sealing of the joints with the flexible mortar she had developed. The young husband worked alongside them, learning the technique so he could help build the next one. That was the pattern they established. Each family that received a Hale hearth learned to build it, then helped construct the next, the knowledge spreading through the settlement the way warmth spread through stone slowly, from one point of contact to the next. The following winter, no one in Ashvale died from the cold. It was a simple fact, stated plainly, the kind of fact that carried no drama but contained everything. The winter came. It was hard enough to test the system. The settlement passed through unharmed. The Hale hearths held, the stone remembered. The family slept warm on a fraction of the fuel they had once burned. The winter after that, the design had spread beyond Ashvale to the next settlement down the valley, then to the county seat, then to homesteads scattered across the territory that Vesper had never seen and never would. Stroud traveled to teach it, carrying the plans he had drawn from Vesper's principles. He had learned it well enough to build it in his sleep. He drove out to the Hale cabin on a summer afternoon. 2 years after the night he had walked 100 yards through 40 below cold, expecting to find her dead. He placed the worn leather notebook on her table, its cover soft with the handling of 2 people who had each read it as if their lives depended on it, because their lives had. I don't need it anymore. You said to bring it back when I understood it well enough. I understand it. Every page. Your husband was a wise man, Mrs. Hale. I wish I'd met him. I wish I'd listened to men like him 30 years ago, instead of thinking I already knew everything worth knowing. Vesper took the notebook. She ran her thumb across the cover, feeling the familiar softness of the leather, the ghost of Elroy's palm still somehow present in it. He'd have liked what you did with it. He always said the earth would teach anyone who was willing to learn. He just didn't think most people were willing. She looked at Stroud. You were. Eventually. It was as close to forgiveness as she would offer, and it was enough. Not the erasure of what he had done, the 6 months of isolation, the public condemnation, the knowledge hidden while she stood alone, that could not be erased. But the acknowledgement that he had changed, that he had done the hard, humbling work of unlearning a lifetime's certainty and building something better in its place. Vesper Hale lived a long, quiet life on the edge of Ashvale. She never sought recognition. She never traveled to the settlements where her design kept families warm through winters she would never witness. She never wrote her name in any book of history, never gave a speech, never accepted the kind of public credit that the world reserved for men who built visible monuments. Her monument was invisible, the absence of frozen bodies in cabins across the territory, the presence of children sleeping warm against stone benches, the plume of thin, cool smoke rising from 100 hillside chimneys. Everett Hale grew up in the warmth his mother had built. He never forgot the winter he was 7 years old, the winter he sat in his shirt sleeves on a warm floor while the best-built house in Ashvale burned its furniture 100 yards away. He never forgot the sound of Stroud's knock on the door that night, the sight of the frozen man staring at the impossible warmth of their home, the way his mother had handed over her firewood, and her husband's notebook to the man who had called her mad. The lesson embedded itself in him deeper than any schooling, that the crowd could be wrong, that certainty was not the same as truth, that the most elegant solution was often the one everyone else walked past because no one had told them to look. He grew tall, taller than his father had been. When he was old enough, he traveled to Helena to learn the building trade, not fireplaces, but the broader craft of construction, the engineering that was beginning to formalize the principles his mother had understood through instinct and her husband's underground wisdom. On the day before he left, Everett took Elroy's notebook down from the shelf where it had lived for years. He turned its soft pages one last time, the diagrams, the marginal notes, his father's faded pencil script, his mother's neater hand. He found the page where Elroy had written, in his rightward-leaning letters, the line that had started everything: "Rock is slow, but rock does not forget." Beneath it, in his mother's upright script, the answer she had written on the night she decided to dig: "I will make the rock remember." Everett took a pencil from the table. Below his mother's line, in his own hand, the hand of a boy who had become a man in the warmth she built, he wrote one more line, and the rock remembered. He closed the notebook. He returned it to its shelf. He looked around the cabin one last time, the warm floor, the stone wall at the back, the small firebox that had saved his life and taught a settlement how to survive. Then he left, carrying with him everything the cabin had given him, everything his mother had built from desperation and a dead man's knowledge, and the stubborn refusal to accept that a small woodpile meant a frozen grave. The winter Everett left, Vesper stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked out across the valley of Ironback Ridge. Snow lay heavy on the slopes, but the killing edge of the Blue Stillness was a memory now, softened by years, by the knowledge that the families scattered across those hills had learned to hold warmth in stone. On the hillsides around Ashvale, thin plumes of cool smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, barely visible against the white sky, so faint a stranger might not notice them at all. Each plume was a family that had stopped fighting the cold and learned to partner with the earth instead. Each was a child sleeping warm through the coldest night, a father who would never have to burn his own table to keep his daughter from shivering, a home that had become a source rather than a shield. The world had told a widow to build a bigger fire. She had chosen to build a smarter one. The world had valued strength. She had valued understanding. The world had looked always to the sky, reaching upward, burning more, demanding more from a fuel supply that could never keep pace with the cold. She had looked down instead into the patient, ancient stone of a hill that everyone else had dismissed as worthless, into the deep constancy that her husband had spent his life learning to trust. She stood in the doorway a while longer, watching the thin smoke rise from the distant chimneys, each one a quiet testament to the wisdom that the earth had been offering all along, waiting only for someone patient enough, desperate enough, clear-eyed enough to listen. Then she turned and went back inside. The stone wall at the back of the cabin was warm beneath her palm, as it had been every day since the night she first taught the rock to remember, as it would be long after the fire had died through the coldest dark the winter could bring. The earth had kept its promise. It always had. It only needed someone willing to ask.